My dear friends, in Jewish time, on this Shabbat, we find ourselves in Deuteronomy chapters 11 through 16. In these nearly 6 chapters, there's so much, including a reminder not to forget the needy who live alongside you, even if the common inclination is either to turn away from the poverty and pain or to live out of sight from the blight. I want to link that human tendency tonight to what we're told to do when animals are sacrificed on the altar, after which the lamb or whatever was eaten like a barbecue. We're told that no blood must be eaten. Why no blood? Because the Torah says, make certain that you do not eat of the blood, for the blood is the life, and you must not consume the life with the flesh. Our Jewish ancestors sensed that blood is the essence of a living creature. Think about it. We often use the expression lifeblood when referring to the essence of life, don't we? Lifeblood was the name of our blood drive at Temple until Vitalant bought Lifeblood, and where 1 pint of blood saves up to 4 lives in our city. How else does blood represent life? When someone is dying, God forbid, what's the language used to often describe? She or he is bleeding to death. The Torah says this week that because blood is the essence of life and represents the sanctity of human life, it must not be consumed. And by the way, for those of you my age and older than 55, that's why kosher meat used to taste like tar. You know those large kosher salt crystals we've all seen at the grocery store? They were used to drain the blood, to remove the blood from the kosher meat before it could be eaten. And many of us have memories of tough pieces of meat. It's this abhorrence for eating blood and for bloodshed altogether that's the biblical root and explanation for the Jewish people's hatred for bloodshed and violence. It flows from a deep historical reverence for the holiness of life. Amidst a scripture like our Hebrew Bible filled with violence and war, I know we can always quote Bible verses. Peace is still always the hope and the yearning. We'll close our service tonight invoking Job, who in chapter 25 speaks of God actually imposing peace from heaven's heights. That's what Oseh Shalom Bimromav means. The Hebrew prophets and later books of the Bible pursue a vision of peace versus a vision of war. Perhaps the climax of the Jewish Bible's critique of warfare is found toward the end of 1 Chronicles in chapter 22, where King David, previously portrayed as the ideal king of Israel in the book of Kings, he's personally scolded by God. God says to David, "You have shed much blood, fought great battles. You shall not build a house for my name. You shall not build the temple. For you, David, have shed too much blood on this earth in my sight." In other words, the task of building God's house, the temple in Jerusalem, cannot be fulfilled by someone who has engaged in violence or endorsed it most of his life. The temple is where God's presence is most closely felt, and bloodshed drives God's presence further away from humankind, not closer. The end goal of the Jewish Bible is a world full of as much peace and unity as possible. A world wherein people of different faiths, creeds, colors, and backgrounds learn to live together peacefully and joyfully. Read the last book of the Hebrew Bible, 2 Chronicles. All the peoples of the world will come as they are and be loved. Although pacifism is not a majority stance in Judaism, a significant strand of Jewish literature extols the virtue of nonviolence in any circumstance. Even pacifism was not a foreign notion to spiritual idealism in early Jewish tradition. And that's why so many of Martin Luther King's sermons grounded in the Jewish prophets, align with Jewish belief and thought. The forgotten MLK Jr. sermon worth Googling is not his mountaintop speech most of us know from the night before he was assassinated here in Memphis. Rather, the sermon to read is the one he gave a year before, entitled Beyond Vietnam. And what he said in that sermon is that any sane person of any religion should hate violence, abhor bloodshed, and the maiming of any other human. But be careful, he warns, because as crises grow and as the war grew, as the days and months go by, he said, be careful for one reason, because you'll get used to it. So much so that you'll become numb to the bloodshed all around you. And you'll begin to think, well, that's just the way it is. And not just with the thousands of body bags coming back from Vietnam back then, he argued. He said, the streets of your own cities. And he was so right. I checked just before the service. 761,000 deaths worldwide. Nearly 175,000 already in the United States alone. And more than a few have said, we just got to get used to it. What about the homicides in the smoldering inner cities, the hot summers, people without jobs, air conditioning, or food, but with an avalanche of guns and gun violence? When this weekend ends, will we really be thinking about the homicides that happened over the weekend? Which leads to the big idea this week in the Torah. The opening verse, See, Re'eh, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. And one of the great philosophical errors prevalent in our time, whether on the internet or in print, is known as moral relativism. The thinking goes like this: everyone's entitled to his or her opinion. There's no right and wrong. What's true to you may be false to me. Each has a right to his or her position. I believe there is room for gray in many matters, and it's true that two opposing opinions may sometimes be accurate. An Orthodox Jew may claim that it's necessary to wait 6 hours after eating a meat meal in order to partake of a milk dish. A conservative Jew may say, well, after 3 hours, not 6. A Reformed Jew may argue that keeping kosher is about something bigger, sanctifying mealtime and pausing to give thanks for whatever you eat. In the area of ritual, like whether you wish to wear a yarmulke or not, or when it comes to taste in style, there's no right or wrong. Instead, there's an old Hebrew expression, B'ta'am v'reach ein lehitvakeach. This rhyming jingle means, in matters of taste and smell, there can be no argument. In other words, there's no right or wrong. Each person's entitled to his or her own preference. But that's not what the Torah is talking about this week. The Torah's realm is morality, decency. And in the moral realm, there is often no room for gray areas. Certain things are either right or wrong, good or bad. There's no in between. And this is what the Torah means when it says, I set before you today a blessing and a curse. You must choose A or B. There's no C, D, E, or F, because C, D, E, and F are outside the bounds of right and good. It's as simple as this. A is good, B is bad. That's it. In fact, the medieval biblical commentator Sforno put it this way. He said, and I quote, be careful that you not be like others who create gray areas when the choice is not relative. The great late Rabbi Sidney Greenberg states it even better. He taught, and I quote, when you go to a surgeon for a serious operation, you don't want someone who is relatively knowledgeable and skilled. When you need a lawyer to protect your rights, you don't engage someone who is in the gray area between well-trained not so well trained. When someone is put in jail for committing a crime, you should not be satisfied to know that 6 members of the jury thought he is guilty and 4 thought he is innocent. And when it comes to moral character, it's clear when someone is lying or telling the truth. To put it simply, the Torah is not talking about your taste or preferences. The Torah is saying that in most, not all, but in most areas of morality, there is right and wrong, truth and false, good and bad. No one can say that maybe Hitler was right and maybe he was wrong. It all depends on your point of view. Anti-Semitism and blatant racism is always evil, the Torah says, because you forfeit the right to worship God when you put down the image of God in another human being. No two sides, no two ways about it, no room for argument. Condemn it, the Torah is saying. Don't try to explain it or defend it. So God says life will not always be full of those kinds of scary, extreme, clear-cut global decisions in daily life, but life will present you and me ongoing choices of right and wrong. So God says, I set before you today a blessing and a curse, good or evil. Take your choice. When you put last week's Torah portion, ekev, which is the root word for the heel of your foot, and this week's Re'eh Torah portion together, you get a deep sense of what Judaism is all about. Rashi says that the reason for the root word for the heel of your foot, ekev, is to teach that obeying the guideposts and mitzvahs of Judaism demands standing on principle, literally putting your foot down for justice and peace and goodness and love over the tyranny and evil people spout and spread in the world. Enter the theme of this week's Re'eh. You have a choice. It's in the singular. You, each of you, facing the very same reality, have a choice to carry on Judaism's call to action, Lador Vador. We have a chance and a choice to carry on this call to action from generation to generation. Amen.
Amen.